"You kissed me while I was out?" the rancher blurted. She smirked. "I saved your life, cowboy." The rancher woke to the rough scratch of a wool blanket against his cheek and a dull ache pulsing behind his eyes, and for a moment he couldn't remember why he was lying inside a dim cabin instead of checking the south fence line like he had planned, but the memory rushed in with the scent of smoke and the copper taste of dried blood he'd been thrown from his horse after it panicked at a rattler's strike, tumbled down the ravine, and everything after that had been a blur of pain and darkness. When he pushed himself upright, blinking at the unfamiliar wooden walls, he caught sight of her standing near the doorway, the woman he had only glimpsed in passing during trade meets, the one rumored to live alone near the river bend. She turned slightly when she noticed he was awake, the beadwork on her fringe swaying, with the quiet grace of someone who moved with complete certainty. What threw him off wasn't the strangeness of waking in her home, it was the curve of her smirk, the barely contained amusement in her eyes, like she was waiting for him to ask the very question already forming on his tongue. "You kissed me while I was out?" he blurted without thinking, then immediately regretted how ridiculous it sounded. But she simply raised a brow, tapped her fingers lightly against her chin, and let that smirk widen like she enjoyed his confusion more than she should. "I saved your life, cowboy," she replied, as if that explained everything, and the way she said it made his face burn hotter than the fever he suspected he had. He tried to stand, but the moment he put weight on his left leg, a sharp bolt of pain forced him back down, and she crossed the cabin in 2 steps, bracing a steadying hand on his shoulder before he could topple. Her touch was firm but gentle, and the contrast startled him more than the fall had. She told him he had been unconscious since the previous afternoon, that she'd found him near the river barely breathing, and that she had dragged him up the steep path to her cabin where she cleaned the gash on his head, bandaged his leg, and kept him from sliding into a deeper stupor. He felt a cocktail of embarrassment and gratitude churning inside him, unsure which emotion would win. Her tone made it clear she didn't care about receiving thanks, yet her smirk lingered like she was waiting for him to challenge her version of events. When he again questioned the kiss, she lifted one shoulder slowly, as if the topic was too trivial to worry over, and answered that she had been trying to wake him, not flirt with him. But the playful glint in her eyes betrayed the innocence of her explanation. He realized then that this was no simple rescuer. She was sharp, confident, and entirely unbothered by his disorientation. As he studied her, still seated because standing felt like tempting fate, he noticed the faint bruise on her upper arm as if she had taken a hit while hauling him to safety. He asked about it, and she casually brushed it off, as though injuries were everyday inconveniences, insisting he should worry about his own battle with gravity before fussing over hers. He couldn't help but stare at her composure, how she commanded the small space without raising her voice, how her presence pressed into the room like a quiet storm that did not need thunder to be felt. She handed him a cup of warm herbal broth, something earthy and slightly bitter, saying it would help with the dizziness. He held the cup awkwardly, watching steam rise like ghosts fleeing the surface, and asked her why she had helped him at all, since people around these parts weren't known for charity when it came to strangers from the ranching line. She gave him a long look, one that measured him from hat to boots even, though his hat had been lost somewhere, along the ravine. She said she didn't rescue people based on their brand or their history, but because she didn't like watching life slip away when she had the means to stop it. That answer stunned him more than if she had declared some mystical obligation, and he felt the weight of his earlier accusation, his impulsive question about the kiss, settling on his shoulders like a fool's burden. After another sip, the dizziness eased, and he found his voice enough to apologize for waking with nonsense on his tongue. She waved off his apology with a flick of her hand, telling him that unconscious men rarely speak wisdom and that she wasn't in the business of being offended by foolishness, though the teasing curve of her lips suggested she would never let him forget it entirely. When a gust of wind outside rattled the cabin door, she stepped out to check something, and he forced himself to follow despite the throbbing in his leg. He leaned against the doorframe as he watched her kneel beside a bundle he hadn't noticed earlier, his gear, neatly gathered and cleaned of dirt. She had even salvaged the small pendant his sister had given him years ago, polished it and set it atop the bundle like it mattered. Something shifted inside him then, something he wasn't prepared for, gratitude mixed with curiosity. Curiosity tangled with a deeper pull he couldn't yet name. She rose and caught him staring at her, not with suspicion or awkwardness, but with a steadiness he wasn't used to meeting. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them felt charged with something unspoken, something that made his earlier assumption feel less far-fetched than he'd meant it to be. She finally broke the silence by telling him he would need to stay a few days until his leg healed, enough to ride, and she made it sound less like a suggestion and more like an order she expected him to obey. He didn't argue, not because he couldn't, but because for the first time in a long while he didn't want to rush back to the noise of the ranch or the endless work waiting for him. Standing there in her doorway, held upright by determination more than strength, he felt the strange certainty that the fall from his horse might have pushed him into something far more unpredictable than any storm he had ever weathered. And as she brushed past him, her shoulder grazing his just enough to send a spark through his still aching body, he knew this was only the beginning. The next morning arrived without warning, at least for the rancher, who had drifted in and out of a restless sleep filled with flashes of the ravine, the woman's steady hands, and the echo of her teasing voice insisting she had saved his life. When he tried to sit up, the dull throb in his leg reminded him he wasn't ready to play tough yet. But before he could even grit his teeth, she was already beside him, placing a carved wooden bowl on the table and telling him to eat if he wanted, to heal fast enough to leave before the next moon. He caught the faint humor hidden in her tone, as though she doubted he could ride even if the moon waited 100 nights, and he felt a strange warmth settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the steam rising from the food. As he ate, she worked around the cabin with quiet efficiency, her braids swaying, her beadwork catching bits of light, moving with the rhythm of someone who had learned self-reliance without bitterness. He watched her longer than he intended, and when she finally noticed, she crossed her arms and asked if staring was a ranch tradition or just his personal habit. He nearly choked on his own embarrassment, stammering an excuse, but she waved it off, though her smirk made it clear she enjoyed knocking him off balance. When she stepped outside to tend to something, he pushed himself to follow, determined to show he wasn't made of glass. The air hit him with a sharp contrast, quiet and open, stretching toward the horizon without anything to block its path. She stood near the riverbank, examining tracks in the soil, and when he approached, she pointed out signs of a mountain cat passing through. During the night, there was no fear in her voice, only awareness, as if she read the land the way he read cattle trails. He told her she shouldn't be out here alone with predators roaming so close, and she shot him a look that landed somewhere between amusement and annoyance, asking if he had learned nothing from the fact that she had dragged his unconscious body halfway up a ravine. He conceded the point, and when she turned away, he thought he saw the faintest hint of pride in her shoulders, like she appreciated the admission more than she let on. As they walked back to the cabin, his leg buckled unexpectedly, but before he could fall, her hand wrapped around his arm, steadying him with surprising strength. He felt his breath hitch, not from pain this time, but from the nearness of her warmth, her calm, the quiet determination in her eyes as she told him to stop pretending he was healed. He muttered that he didn't want to be a burden, and she told him bluntly that if he were a burden, she would have left him in the ravine. That truth, sharp and sincere, made him laugh in a way he hadn't in months, and she shook her head as if amused by how easily he found humor where most men would sulk. Inside the cabin, she rewrapped his bandages, and he watched her hands work with practiced precision, each movement gentle but unwavering. He found himself wanting to ask questions, not about the kiss anymore, but about her life, her past, the strength that shaped her. But he didn't know where to begin. She sensed it anyway, and told him she lived alone by choice, that peace was easier to protect when it wasn't tied to anyone else's battles. He understood that more than he admitted. The ranch demanded loyalty he hadn't chosen but inherited, a weight he sometimes carried out of duty rather than desire. As she finished securing the bandage, their eyes met for a moment longer than either expected, and he felt the air shift between them, thickening with something unspoken yet unmistakably real. Before he could speak, she told him quietly that he would be able to ride by the next morning if he didn't do anything foolish. And though her voice was steady, there was a shadow behind her, words that suggested she wasn't entirely eager for him to leave. The realization struck him harder than the fall had. The thought of riding away felt heavier than it should have after only a few days. But he didn't know how to say that without sounding like a man grasping at fantasies. When dawn came, pale and quiet, he saddled his horse, with her watching from the doorway, where he had first seen her smirk at his dazed confusion. As he mounted, he hesitated, unsure whether to thank her, apologize, or confess the truth sitting stubbornly in his chest, that he didn't want their paths to split so quickly. She stepped closer, brushed a stray leaf from his shoulder, and told him not to fall off any cliffs for a while, because she had no intention of hauling him up another one. He chuckled, but before he could offer a proper goodbye, she leaned in, light as breath, and pressed a brief kiss to the corner of his mouth. Swift, confident, and entirely disarming. When he pulled back in surprise, she gave him that familiar smirk and said, "That one wasn't to wake you up." The heat rising in him nearly overpowered the morning chill, and he found himself promising he'd be back, though he didn't disguise the meaning behind it. She didn't try to stop him, didn't cling, didn't soften. She simply nodded as if she had known his promise long before he spoke it. And as he rode toward the horizon, every step of the horse carrying him farther from the cabin yet deeper into a future he hadn't expected, he realized he wasn't leaving. Something behind he was riding toward, something he had every intention of returning to.